Welcome to Night Owl Podcast History, the place where we travel together into the past, exploring the turning points and the mysteries that shaped our world. Tonight, I invite you to lean back, close your eyes if you wish, and imagine yourself transported to a time when the fate of entire continents was decided not in marble palaces or grand cathedrals, but on the windswept steppes of Central Asia. Let me ask you something to spark your curiosity. How did a group of nomadic herders, people without stone cities, without permanent walls, without libraries or universities, manage to forge the largest contiguous empire in human history? How did the Mongols, under Genghis Khan and his successors, not only conquer lands stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe, but also maintain authority over this vast and diverse territory for generations? If that question fascinates you, then you are in exactly the right place. And before we set our horses loose on the steppe, let me kindly ask, if you enjoy these deep journeys into the past, do not forget to subscribe, like, and share Night Owl Podcast History. It helps this little corner of the internet continue to grow, and it ensures you will not miss any of our upcoming adventures. Now, let us begin. Picture the year 1162. The wide, open steppe stretches endlessly beneath a sky so vast it seems to swallow everything. There are no great cities here, no tall towers, only rolling grasslands, the silhouettes of herds moving in the distance, and the yurts of nomadic tribes dotting the horizon. This is the birthplace of a boy who would later be called Genghis Khan, though at birth his name was Temüjin. His early life was not the tale of a destined emperor. Rather, it was the story of hardship, betrayal, and survival. Temüjin's father, Yesugei, was poisoned when Temüjin was still a child. The boy's family was abandoned by their own clan, left to fend for themselves in the brutal environment of the Mongolian steppe. Hunger and danger were constant companions, and Temüjin grew up with little more than his determination to survive. Yet within this unforgiving childhood, the foundations of a future empire were laid. For the Mongols, life was already a harsh training ground, shaping warriors who could ride for days without stopping, who could endure cold and scarcity, who could read the land as though it were a book written in grass and sky. The world that Temüjin inherited was fragmented. Dozens of tribes roamed the steppe, each with their own leaders, their own feuds, their own shifting alliances. Warfare was constant, but it was local, confined to raids and revenge between neighbors. No one tribe had managed to dominate all the others. The steppe was a mosaic of competing clans, always changing, always unstable. Yet within this chaos, Temüjin perceived a possibility. He envisioned unity where others only saw division. Temüjin's rise to power was slow and dangerous. He began by forging alliances, one by one, often sealed through marriage or sworn brotherhood. But what set him apart was his radical departure from tradition. On the steppe, loyalty usually belonged to kinship. Temüjin broke that mold by rewarding talent and loyalty above bloodline. A warrior who proved himself valuable could rise in rank regardless of his ancestry. This principle, simple yet revolutionary, would later allow the Mongol armies to function with astonishing discipline and effectiveness. In time, Temüjin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. This was not a mere title of vanity. It was a declaration of ambition. He did not intend to rule only one tribe, nor even one region. He aimed for the unification of the entire Mongol steppe, and from there, the conquest of lands beyond. But how did the Mongols manage to achieve this when other nomadic confederations had risen and fallen before them? The answer lies in a combination of factors: military genius, cultural flexibility, and a system of governance that, while harsh, was astonishingly effective for its time. Let us first look at the military aspect. The Mongol army was not the largest in the world, nor did it possess the most advanced weaponry. What it had was mobility, discipline, and intelligence. Mongol warriors were all skilled horsemen from childhood. Each man carried not just one horse, but often several, allowing them to switch mounts and travel long distances without exhausting their animals. Their composite bows, made from wood, horn, and sinew, were capable of extraordinary range and power, allowing Mongol archers to shoot accurately even while galloping at full speed. The Mongols mastered tactics of feigned retreat, drawing enemies into traps where hidden units awaited. They coordinated their movements with precision, using signal flags, drums, and horns to command thousands across the battlefield. And perhaps most importantly, they gathered intelligence. Scouts traveled far ahead of the main army, mapping terrain, studying enemies, and reporting back. In an age when many armies marched blindly, the Mongols fought with knowledge. Yet conquest alone does not create an empire. It can topple cities, but it cannot govern them. The true brilliance of the Mongols lay not only in their capacity to destroy, but also in their ability to rule. Once Genghis Khan subdued a territory, he implemented systems to ensure order. He introduced a written legal code known as the Yasa, which enforced discipline among his own people and regulated behavior across the empire. Religious tolerance was another remarkable feature of Mongol governments. While Genghis Khan himself followed the traditional shamanistic practices of the steppe, he allowed conquered peoples to keep their faiths, whether they were Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, or something else entirely. This policy not only reduced resistance, but also fostered cooperation, allowing diverse cultures to function under Mongol rule. At the same time, the Mongols integrated skilled individuals from conquered lands into their administration. Chinese engineers, Persian administrators, and Arab scholars were all employed in service of the empire. The Mongols were pragmatic. If you were useful, you were valued, regardless of your origin. This flexibility was crucial in managing such a vast and varied realm. As the empire expanded, stretching from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea, the Mongols faced the immense challenge of connecting and controlling their territories. Their solution was the Yam system, a relay network of stations spread across the empire. Riders could change horses at these stations, carrying messages and goods across thousands of miles at incredible speed. This system has often been compared to a medieval version of the postal service, and it allowed the empire to maintain communication and control over distances that would have seemed impossible to others. Step by step, through strategy, governance, and adaptation, the Mongols transformed themselves from scattered tribes into a world-spanning empire. And yet, their story was only beginning. The rise of Genghis Khan was not just about conquest. It was about creating a legacy that his descendants would carry forward, reshaping the map of the world in ways that still echo today. When we left our story, Genghis Khan had begun to unify the Mongol tribes, turning fragmented clans into a formidable confederation. But unifying the steppe was only the beginning. To build an empire, he would have to extend his power far beyond the grassy plains of Mongolia. And so, the next phase of the story takes us into the lands of northern China, Central Asia, and eventually the farthest reaches of Europe and the Middle East. Let us return to the 12th and 13th centuries. To the south of Mongolia lay the great Chinese dynasties, at that time divided and weakened. In the north was the Jin dynasty, ruling over the prosperous lands between the Yellow River and the Great Wall. To the west stretched the kingdoms of the Khwarezmian Empire, controlling the ancient Silk Road trade routes. These were rich and powerful states compared to the nomadic Mongols, yet within a few decades they would fall to Genghis Khan's armies. How was such a reversal of fortune possible? The key lay in strategy and ruthlessness. Genghis Khan did not launch campaigns blindly. He studied his enemies, probed their weaknesses, and struck with devastating precision. Against the Jin dynasty, for example, he employed siege engineers, some of them captured from earlier campaigns, who could build catapults and other machines capable of tearing down city walls. The Mongols had been born on horseback, but they were not afraid to adopt the technology of their enemies if it served their purpose. The siege of Zhongdu, the city we know today as Beijing, was one of the defining moments of Mongol expansion. In 1215, after months of siege, the city fell. Accounts describe the devastation as immense, with fire and destruction sweeping through its streets. For the Mongols, it was not only a victory of arms, but also a statement of power. No fortress, no matter how mighty, could withstand their determination. But it was in Central Asia that Genghis Khan's empire building reached its most dramatic stage. The Khwarezmian Empire, centered in Persia and stretching across what is now Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan, was a thriving state with strong armies and wealthy cities. Genghis Khan initially sought peace and trade, sending envoys to establish relations. Yet when the Khwarezmian ruler, Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, not only rejected these overtures but executed the Mongol envoys, Genghis Khan responded with fury. The campaign that followed was nothing short of catastrophic for the Khwarezmian world. From 1219 to 1221, Mongol armies swept through city after city, Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, leaving behind devastation on a scale rarely seen before. Chroniclers recount how entire populations were slaughtered or enslaved, how cities that had flourished for centuries were reduced to ruins. Genghis Khan was not only waging war, he was sending a message. To resist him was to invite annihilation. And yet, amidst the destruction, the Mongols also displayed a paradoxical pragmatism. Skilled artisans, scholars, and engineers were spared, sent back to Mongolia, or relocated to serve the empire. The Mongols recognized the value of knowledge and expertise, and they harvested it as carefully as they did the wealth of conquered cities. By the time of Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Sea of Japan to the Caspian Sea. It was a realm larger than any other in recorded history up to that point, and it had been forged in less than 3 decades. But with Genghis gone, a question loomed. Could such an empire survive the loss of its founder? Here we encounter another of the Mongols' remarkable strengths, their system of succession and governance. Unlike many empires where power fragmented after the death of a ruler, the Mongols had developed a tradition of the Kurultai, a council where leaders of the clans would gather to elect the next great Khan. Though not without disputes, this system allowed the empire to maintain unity long enough for Genghis Khan's descendants to continue expansion. It was his third son, Ogedei, who became the next great Khan. And under his leadership, the Mongols advanced even farther. They completed the conquest of the Jin dynasty in northern China, bringing fertile lands and millions of subjects under their control. They pushed into Eastern Europe, clashing with the armies of Hungary and Poland. At the same time, other branches of the family advanced into Persia and the Middle East. Imagine the astonishment of medieval Europeans when they first heard of the Mongols. These mysterious horsemen from the east seemed unstoppable, appearing suddenly on the horizon, devastating entire armies, and then vanishing again into the steppe. Rumors spread wildly. Some believed they were the descendants of the biblical tribes of Gog and Magog, unleashed as a punishment upon Christendom. Others thought they might be the soldiers of Prester John, a mythical Christian king from the east. The truth was far more complex and far more unsettling. The Mongols were neither myth nor legend, but a disciplined, organized force with clear objectives. As Ogedei ruled, the Mongols demonstrated another essential feature of their empire, the ability to administer conquered territories through local governance. Rather than impose a single rigid system, they often adapted to the existing structures. In China, they used Chinese bureaucrats. In Persia, they relied on Persian administrators. In Russia, they appointed local princes as tributaries. The Mongol presence was unmistakable, but it was not uniform. Flexibility was their strength. And yet, beneath this flexibility lay a common thread: tribute. The Mongols demanded loyalty and tribute from all who lived under their rule. Cities and states that submitted could expect protection and a degree of autonomy. Those that resisted faced destruction. It was a simple formula, brutal but effective, and it kept the empire intact across vast distances. The Mongols also transformed trade. With their conquests, the Silk Road came under a single authority for the first time in centuries. Caravans could travel from China to Europe with relative safety, guarded by Mongol patrols and supplied by the Yam system of relay stations. This period of stability is often called the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. Goods, ideas, and even diseases traveled along these routes. Chinese inventions such as paper money and gunpowder reached Europe, while European merchants like Marco Polo made their way to the court of the Great Khan. But empire is never static. While Ogedei expanded and ruled, tensions were already brewing beneath the surface. The unity of the Mongol clans was fragile, and succession after each great Khan threatened to shatter the empire. As we move forward, we will see how Genghis Khan's heirs carried the torch, sometimes together, sometimes against one another, and how the Mongol Empire reached both its zenith and its fragmentation. For now, though, let us pause and imagine the world as it appeared in the mid-13th century. Across Asia and into Europe, the Mongol horsemen rode with unmatched confidence. Cities that had once seemed eternal lay in ashes, while new connections tied distant lands together. The world was shrinking, bound by the hoofbeats of Mongol horses. As the 13th century progressed, the Mongol Empire stood at a height unmatched in its scale. Under Ogedei Khan, the son of Genghis, the empire had not only consolidated its hold on China, but also extended deep into the heart of Europe. It is here that our journey brings us to one of the most dramatic chapters in Mongol history, the Western campaigns that brought their armies into the fields of Hungary and Poland, shaking the foundations of medieval Europe itself. The invasion of Europe was led by Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis, accompanied by the brilliant general Subutai. Subutai, often called the greatest strategist of the Mongol age, had already proven himself in countless campaigns. With him, the Mongols crossed the frozen rivers of Russia, moved through the plains of Hungary, and clashed with knights and kings who had never before faced an enemy like this. Let us imagine the scene. It is the year 1241. The spring winds blow across the plains of Hungary. The armies of Europe, clad in heavy armor, their banners fluttering, prepare to meet an enemy they scarcely understand. Knights, accustomed to frontal charges and the clash of steel, await the battle. And then, on the horizon, the horsemen appear. Thousands of them, swift as shadows, their arrows darkening the sky, their movements precise and fluid. At the Battle of Mohi, the Hungarian forces were utterly crushed. The Mongols feigned retreat, lured their enemies into pursuit, and then closed in with devastating force. In Poland, at the Battle of Legnica, the story was the same. The combined forces of Polish knights and their allies were swept aside. For a moment, it seemed as though Europe itself might fall to the Mongols, just as Asia had. And yet, at the very moment of greatest threat, fate intervened. News arrived that Ogedei Khan had died in distant Karakoram, the capital of the Mongol Empire. According to tradition, the princes of Genghis Khan's line were required to return to Mongolia to elect a new great Khan at the Kurultai. The invasion of Europe, which might have rewritten the entire history of the continent, came to a sudden halt. The Mongols withdrew as swiftly as they had come, leaving behind ruins and memories of terror. This moment highlights one of the paradoxes of the Mongol Empire. Their expansion was relentless, yet it was always tied to the traditions of the steppe, to the rituals of succession, to the fragile unity of the clans. The death of a great Khan could halt armies in their tracks, for without consensus at the Kurultai, the empire itself might fracture. The succession that followed brought Gayuk Khan, another grandson of Genghis, to power. But his reign was short and troubled. Disputes between different branches of the family threatened the unity of the empire. It was not until Mongol Khan, a grandson of Genghis through his son Tolui, ascended the throne in 1251 that stability returned. Mongol was a strong leader, determined to continue the expansion of Mongol power. And under his rule, the empire turned its gaze both eastward and westward once again. In the east, the Mongols sought to complete their conquest of China, where the southern Song dynasty still held sway. In the west, their ambitions reached into the Middle East, where the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad still stood as a symbol of Islamic power. It was Mongol's brother, Hulagu, who led the western campaigns. In 1258, his armies reached the walls of Baghdad. The city, once the jewel of the Islamic world, the seat of the caliphs and a center of learning and culture, faced the Mongol storm. What followed was one of the most infamous events of medieval history, the sack of Baghdad. The Mongols breached the city, and the destruction was catastrophic. Libraries, including the famed House of Wisdom, were burned. Scholars and citizens were massacred. The Tigris River, it is said, ran black with the ink of countless books thrown into its waters, and red with the blood of the slain. The Abbasid Caliphate, already weakened, was effectively extinguished as a political power. For the Islamic world, it was a shattering blow. Yet even here, the pattern we have seen before emerged. While destruction marked their conquests, the Mongols also incorporated the skills and knowledge of the lands they subdued. In Persia and Mesopotamia, they employed administrators who helped to govern and collect tribute. They established new trade routes and fortified their control over the crossroads of civilizations. Meanwhile, in the east, Mongol Khan himself led campaigns against the southern Song. But in 1259, during the fighting in China, Mongol died. Once again, the empire was thrown into crisis. His brothers, Hulagu in the west and Kublai in the east, now contested the succession. What followed was a civil war among the Mongols themselves, a struggle that would divide the empire into separate khanates. From this moment onward, the Mongol Empire would no longer be a single unified state. Instead, it would become a collection of four great khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China under Kublai Khan, the Ilkhanate in Persia under Hulagu and his descendants, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia and Eastern Europe under Batu's line. This division did not mark the immediate collapse of Mongol power. On the contrary, each khanate remained formidable in its own right, and together they continued to shape the destiny of Eurasia. But the dream of a single empire stretching from the Pacific to the Mediterranean was gone. The vastness of the realm, combined with the ambitions of rival princes, had proven too much even for the legacy of Genghis Khan to contain. And yet, before we speak of decline, we must turn to one of the most extraordinary figures in Mongol history, Kublai Khan. For it was under him that the Mongol Empire reached not only its greatest territorial extent, but also its most refined form of governance, blending steppe traditions with the administrative sophistication of China. Picture Kublai, intelligent, curious, more inclined towards settled civilization than his forefathers, yet still a Mongol at heart. He would become the first non-Chinese ruler to sit upon the dragon throne and establish the Yuan dynasty. His reign would mark a turning point, not only for the Mongols, but for China itself. The story of Kublai Khan begins not in the windswept steppes of Mongolia, but in the refined courts and bustling cities of China. Born in 1215, Kublai grew up as a grandson of Genghis Khan, surrounded by the traditions of the steppe, yet deeply intrigued by the world of settled civilizations. Unlike many of his ancestors who remained suspicious of city life, Kublai was fascinated by Chinese culture, its philosophies, and its governance. This dual identity, part Mongol warrior, part Chinese ruler, would define his legacy. When Mongol Khan died in 1259, Kublai was campaigning against the southern Song dynasty in China. News of his brother's death forced him to pause, for the succession crisis demanded his attention. In 1260, Kublai declared himself Great Khan, but his claim was contested by his younger brother, Arikboke. What followed was a civil war within the Mongol family, stretching across Central Asia, pitting Kublai's vision of a more Sinicized, empire-oriented rule against Arikboke's defense of traditional steppe ways. The war ended in Kublai's favor, but the cost was immense. The unity of the empire was further fractured, and from this point onward, the Khanates operated with increasing independence. Nevertheless, Kublai emerged not only as the Great Khan, but also as the ruler of China, where he established the Yuan dynasty in 1271. For the first time in history, the entirety of China was under foreign rule. Kublai's decision to found the Yuan dynasty was more than symbolic. He embraced Chinese titles, rituals, and bureaucratic systems, presenting himself as the legitimate son of heaven. He relocated the capital to what is now Beijing, then called Dadu, marking a profound shift from the mobile capital of Karakoram in Mongolia. The Mongols, once nomads of the steppe, now anchored themselves in the heart of Chinese civilization. But what kind of ruler was Kublai Khan? Accounts describe him as intelligent, pragmatic, and open to innovation. He surrounded himself with advisors from diverse backgrounds: Chinese scholars, Muslim astronomers, Persian administrators, and even Europeans, such as the Venetian traveler Marco Polo, who would later immortalize Kublai's court in his famous writings. Under Kublai's rule, the Mongol Empire reached its greatest territorial extent. His armies finally subdued the southern Song dynasty in 1279 after a long and difficult campaign. The fall of the Song brought the whole of China under Mongol control, uniting north and south for the first time in centuries. The Yuan dynasty now ruled over a vast and populous land with tens of millions of subjects, fertile farmlands, and bustling cities. Kublai was not content with ruling China alone. His ambitions extended outward, and he launched campaigns to expand Mongol influence across Asia. He sent armies into Southeast Asia, invading Vietnam, Burma, and even Java. He attempted to conquer Japan not once but twice, in 1274 and 1281. Both invasions famously failed, thwarted by fierce Japanese resistance and by powerful typhoons that the Japanese would later call kamikaze, or divine winds. These failures marked the limits of Mongol expansion. The sea, unlike the steppe, was not their natural domain. Their fleets, hastily constructed and manned by reluctant subject peoples, could not match the storms of the Pacific. The invasions drained resources and morale, signaling that even the Mongols had boundaries they could not cross. Yet within China, Kublai sought to govern wisely. He reformed taxation, improved infrastructure, and invested in agriculture. He expanded the Grand Canal, ensuring that grain from the fertile south could be transported to the northern capital. He established paper currency, though its overuse eventually led to inflation. He encouraged trade, making China a central hub of the Silk Road under the Pax Mongolica. It was during Kublai's reign that Marco Polo arrived at his court. The Venetian traveler, who spent nearly 2 decades in Mongol service, later described the grandeur of Kublai's capital, the wealth of the Yuan dynasty, and the sophistication of Chinese civilization. To Europeans, Marco Polo's tales seemed almost fantastical, filled with cities larger than anything in the West, with technologies and luxuries scarcely imaginable. Through his writings, the Mongol Empire became a window through which Europe glimpsed the riches of the East. But Kublai's reign was not without challenges. Governing China was far more complex than ruling the steppe. The Mongols were a tiny minority ruling over a vast and ancient civilization with deep traditions. Kublai attempted to balance Mongol privilege with Chinese administration, but tensions simmered. The Mongols often reserved the highest positions for themselves and their allies, creating resentment among the Chinese elite. Revolts broke out, and although Kublai suppressed them, the seeds of discontent were sown. Furthermore, the Yuan dynasty faced difficulties in integrating the many cultures of its empire. While religious tolerance remained a hallmark of Mongol rule, the differences in language, custom, and governance created strains. The Mongols excelled in conquest, but long-term administration was a heavier burden. By the time Kublai Khan died in 1294, the empire he had inherited and expanded was both magnificent and fragile. The Yuan dynasty ruled a united China, but unrest lingered beneath the surface. The other khanates, Golden Horde, Chagatai, and Ilkhanate, operated increasingly as independent powers, pursuing their own interests. The dream of Genghis Khan's single united empire was now only a memory. Yet, even in its divided form, the Mongol Empire reshaped the world. It created connections between East and West, facilitated the movement of goods, ideas, and people, and laid the foundations for a more interconnected Eurasia. In the centuries to come, the echoes of Mongol rule would still be heard in trade routes, in political structures, and even in the fears and legends of nations that once faced their armies. As we move forward, we'll turn to the later history of the Khanates, the rise and fall of the Golden Horde in Russia, the cultural flowering of the Ilkhanate in Persia, the struggles of the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the eventual collapse of the Yuan dynasty in China. Together, these stories show not only the heights of Mongol power, but also the inevitability of its decline. For even the greatest empires, no matter how vast, are bound by the limits of time. When Kublai Khan passed away in 1294, the Mongol world had already begun to drift apart. Though he had ruled China as the emperor of the Yuan dynasty, his relatives governed other corners of the empire as independent khanates. These states, while sharing a common heritage and often cooperating when convenient, increasingly pursued their own destinies. To understand how the Mongols not only conquered but also governed their vast territory, we must now explore the stories of these successor khanates, each with its own triumphs and challenges. Let us begin in the west, where Hulagu Khan and his descendants established the Ilkhanate in Persia. After the sack of Baghdad in 1258, Hulagu carved out a realm that stretched across Iran, Iraq, and parts of Anatolia. This new Mongol state was deeply influenced by Persian culture and administration. Though the early years of the Ilkhanate were marked by violence and resistance, over time the Mongols there adopted many local customs. Persian officials played a key role in governance, and Persian art, science, and literature flourished under their rule. Religion, too, became a defining issue. The Mongols had long practiced tolerance, but within the Ilkhanate, rulers gradually converted to Islam. Ghazan Khan, who reigned from 1295 to 1304, officially embraced Islam and made it the state religion. His conversion transformed the Ilkhanate, aligning it more closely with the Islamic world and ensuring greater acceptance among his subjects. At the same time, Ghazan introduced reforms to stabilize the economy, regulate taxation, and restore agricultural lands that had been devastated by war. While the Ilkhanate integrated itself into the Persian and Islamic tradition, another Mongol state emerged in the northwest, the Golden Horde. Founded by Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, the Golden Horde controlled the vast steppes of Russia, Ukraine, and parts of Eastern Europe. Their rule was unlike that of the Ilkhans, for here the Mongols did not settle into cities or adopt local culture to the same extent. Instead, they maintained the nomadic traditions of the steppe, ruling their Slavic subjects from afar and collecting tribute through local princes. The Russian principalities, fragmented and often at odds with one another, submitted to Mongol overlordship after devastating campaigns in the 1230s and 1240s. Cities such as Kiev were sacked, and new centers like Moscow rose under Mongol shadow. The princes of Moscow, in particular, grew powerful as tax collectors for the horde, laying the foundations for what would one day become the Russian state. Religion again played a curious role. The Mongols of the Golden Horde were initially shamanistic, later influenced by Islam. Yet they tolerated the Orthodox Christian faith of their Russian subjects. Monasteries often received protection, and the Orthodox Church maintained its influence, even as secular rulers bowed to the Khans. Further east, in Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate took shape, named after Chagatai, the second son of Genghis Khan. This Khanate encompassed a vast region stretching from modern-day Uzbekistan into western China. Unlike the Ilkhans or the Golden Horde, the Chagatai rulers struggled to maintain stability. Internal divisions, economic difficulties, and conflicts with their neighbors often weakened their power. Yet the Chagatai Khanate remained a crossroads of cultures, sitting astride the Silk Road, where merchants, pilgrims, and envoys continued to pass. Each of these khanates represented a different path of Mongol rule. The Ilkhanate embraced Persian Islamic traditions, blending nomadic heritage with settled civilization. The Golden Horde clung to the ways of the steppe, ruling lightly over their subjects while sustaining nomadic power. The Chagatai Khanate remained fractured yet vital as a cultural bridge. And in China, the Yuan dynasty stood as the most ambitious attempt by the Mongols to transform themselves from conquerors into emperors of a settled realm. Together, these khanates extended the influence of the Mongols across Eurasia, but they also revealed the limits of their empire. Distance, diversity, and ambition pulled them apart. The unity forged by Genghis Khan could not endure beyond a few generations. And yet, despite their divisions, the Mongols left a deep imprint on every land they ruled. In Persia, Mongol patronage encouraged advances in astronomy, medicine, and architecture. In Russia, Mongol overlordship reshaped political structures, laying the groundwork for Moscow's eventual rise. In Central Asia, Mongol rule facilitated trade and cultural exchange. And in China, the Yuan dynasty connected East Asia more closely to the wider world than ever before. It is here that we must pause to consider the Pax Mongolica once more. Though often remembered for destruction, the Mongol Empire also created stability on a scale rarely seen before. With trade routes secure under Mongol protection, merchants and travelers moved with greater freedom. Caravans carried silk, spices, and precious metals across the continent. Ideas and technologies spread. Printing, gunpowder, paper money, and even artistic styles crossed borders. The Mongols, without intending to, acted as conduits of globalization long before the modern age. But there was a darker side to this interconnectedness. Along with goods and knowledge, disease traveled swiftly along the Silk Road. In the 14th century, the bubonic plague spread across Eurasia, carried by trade routes that the Mongols had opened and secured. The pandemic, known in Europe as the Black Death, devastated populations from China to the Mediterranean, reshaping societies in its wake. Ironically, the same networks that symbolized Mongol achievement also became channels of catastrophe. By the mid-14th century, the decline of the Mongol Khanates was becoming apparent. In Persia, the Ilkhanate fractured after the death of Abu Sa'id in 1335, giving rise to local dynasties. In Russia, the power of the Golden Horde waned as Moscow and other principalities grew stronger. The Chagatai Khanate splintered into rival factions, while in China, the Yuan dynasty faced mounting unrest, natural disasters, and resistance from the native Han population. Still, the story of Mongol rule does not end with their decline. For even as their empire faded, the Mongols had reshaped the political, economic, and cultural map of Eurasia. And in Central Asia, a new power would rise from the remnants of their world, a conqueror who would see himself as heir to Genghis Khan's legacy, Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane. Before we meet Timur, however, we must trace the last great days of the Yuan dynasty in China and the turbulent struggles that brought Mongol rule there to an end. The Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan, stood as the most ambitious experiment in Mongol history. For nearly a century, the Mongols ruled China not as foreign overlords who kept their distance, but as emperors who claimed the mandate of heaven itself. Yet by the middle of the 14th century, the cracks in their power had widened into deep fissures. What had been a dynasty of triumph began to crumble under the weight of rebellion, corruption, and natural disaster. To understand why the Yuan dynasty collapsed, we must look at the challenges the Mongols faced in governing a civilization as vast and complex as China. From the very beginning, the Mongols were outsiders, ruling a majority Han Chinese population with its own traditions, philosophies, and expectations of governance. Kublai Khan, as we saw, attempted to bridge this gap by adopting Chinese rituals and institutions. Yet the Mongols always remained distinct. They reserved the highest offices for themselves and for trusted foreigners, often placing Central Asians and Muslims in administrative roles above the native Chinese. This created resentment that smoldered for decades. The economic system of the Yuan also strained under the demands of empire. Paper currency, introduced with enthusiasm by the Mongols, was initially effective in facilitating trade. But over time, as wars drained resources and as the state printed more notes without sufficient backing, inflation spiraled. The once stable economy grew unstable, and the burden of taxation weighed heavily on peasants. Nature, too, turned against the dynasty. In the 14th century, a series of floods, droughts, and famines devastated the countryside. The Yellow River, long both a source of life and a bringer of disaster, changed its course several times, inundating farmland and displacing millions. As hardship spread, banditry increased, and peasant uprisings began to stir. Among these uprisings, one movement would eventually bring the Yuan dynasty to its end, the Red Turban Rebellion. Emerging in the 1350s, the Red Turbans combined elements of Buddhism, Taoism, and popular millenarian belief. They proclaimed that the Mongols had lost the mandate of heaven, that the dynasty was corrupt and illegitimate, and that the time had come for renewal. Their message resonated with desperate peasants and weary officials alike. The Mongols attempted to suppress the rebellion, but their authority was faltering.
Corruption at court weakened the dynasty, and infighting among Mongol princes undermined unity. The Yuan armies, once feared across continents, now struggled to maintain control within their own borders. Out of the chaos rose a remarkable figure, Zhu Yuanzhang. Born into poverty, orphaned by famine, he joined a Buddhist monastery before becoming involved with the Red Turbans. Through talent, charisma, and determination, Zhu rose from obscurity to command armies of rebels. Gradually, he consolidated power, defeating rivals and presenting himself as the champion of the Han Chinese against the Mongol rulers. In 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang's forces captured Dazhu, the Yuan capital. The last Yuan emperor fled north into Mongolia, and with this, Mongol rule over China was brought to an end. Zhu proclaimed himself the founder of a new dynasty, the Ming, which would rule China for nearly 3 centuries. The Mongols, once masters of the Middle Kingdom, were driven back to their ancestral steppe. The fall of the Yuan was not merely the collapse of a dynasty, it was a turning point in Chinese history. The Ming dynasty embraced a vision of native revival, rebuilding the Great Wall to guard against future invasions and reasserting the authority of Han traditions. Yet the memory of Mongol rule lingered. The Yuan had reshaped China's connections with the wider world, opening trade routes, introducing new technologies, and leaving behind a legacy that could not simply be erased. As the Yuan dynasty fell, the other khanates too faced decline. In Persia, the Ilkhanate disintegrated after the death of Abu Sa'id in 1335. Without a strong heir, the state splintered into smaller dynasties, each vying for power. In Russia, the Golden Horde's grip weakened as the princes of Moscow grew bolder, eventually challenging Mongol authority and laying the groundwork for independence.
The Chagatai Khanate fractured into eastern and western halves, plagued by internal divisions and pressure from neighbors. It seemed as though the great Mongol Empire, once so unstoppable, was dissolving into fragments, each unable to recapture the unity of Genghis Khan's age. And yet, from these fragments, a new conqueror would emerge, one who saw himself as heir to the Mongol legacy, though he was not of Genghis Khan's direct line. This was Timur, or Tamerlane, whose campaigns in the late 14th century would reignite the flame of conquest and terror. But before we follow Timur's story, let us pause to reflect on the broader pattern of Mongol decline. Why did an empire that spanned so far and that seemed so invincible collapse so quickly after reaching its zenith? The reasons are many. The challenge of governing diverse peoples, the burden of maintaining vast territories, the strains of succession disputes, and the destructive power of rebellion and disease. The very qualities that made the Mongols great conquerors, their mobility, their reliance on clan loyalty, their pragmatism, did not always lend themselves to stable governance. Still, the Mongols had achieved what no other people before them had done. They had created a world empire that connected the Pacific to the Mediterranean, that brought Europe and Asia into closer contact, and that left behind a legacy still felt centuries later. Their empire might have fractured, but its impact endured. Now, as the 14th century closes and the 15th dawns, the world is about to witness a new wave of conquest, one that will echo the Mongols, yet also differ in crucial ways. The stage is set for Timur, a man who would rise from Central Asia to carve out an empire with fire and sword, invoking the spirit of Genghis Khan while forging his own brutal path. The story of the Mongol Empire might seem, by the late 14th century, to have reached its conclusion. The Khanates were divided, the Yuan dynasty had fallen, and the once mighty Golden Horde was losing its grip on Russia. Yet history has a way of echoing itself. Out of the shifting sands of Central Asia, a new conqueror rose, a man who would drape himself in the memory of Genghis Khan, even though he was not a direct descendant. His name was Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane. His rise was a reminder that the Mongol legacy was far from dead. To understand Timur's story, we must first picture the setting. Central Asia in the mid-14th century was a land of fragmented power. The Chagatai Khanate, once a unified Mongol state, had splintered into eastern and western halves. Local rulers, tribal chiefs, and warlords vied for supremacy, each commanding their own bands of warriors. The once stable routes of the Silk Road had grown dangerous, and the steppe was filled with opportunity for anyone bold enough to seize it. Timur was born in 1336, near the city of Kesh, not far from Samarkand, in what is today Uzbekistan. His origins were not those of a Khan, but of a lesser noble from the Barlas tribe, a group of Turkicized Mongols who had settled in the region. From the start, Timur was ambitious, resourceful, and ruthless. As a young man, he suffered injuries in battle that left him with a permanent limp, hence the name by which the world would remember him, Tamerlane, meaning Tamar the Lame. Despite this disability, or perhaps because of it, Timur developed a relentless drive. He mastered the politics of the steppe, forging alliances and eliminating rivals with cunning precision. He understood, as Genghis Khan had centuries before, that power on the steppe was not inherited but seized. By the 1360s, Timur had positioned himself as the dominant power in Transoxiana, the region between the Amu Darya and Sur Darya rivers. Yet Timur faced a problem: legitimacy. Unlike Genghis Khan, he was not of the Borjigan clan, the sacred lineage that claimed descent from Genghis himself. On the steppe, this mattered deeply. To overcome this obstacle, Timur cloaked himself in Mongol tradition. He married into the family of Genghis Khan, presenting himself as a son-in-law to the great lineage. He ruled in the name of puppet Khans from the Chagatai line, though he himself held the true power. And he adopted the title Gurgan, meaning son-in-law, as a way to assert his connection to the legacy of Genghis Khan. This calculated use of heritage allowed Timur to portray himself as the heir of the Mongol Empire. In reality, he was building something new, an empire that combined the ferocity of the steppe warrior with the sophistication of Persian Islamic culture. His capital at Samarkand would become not only a base of conquest, but also a glittering center of art, science, and architecture. Timur's military campaigns were among the most brutal and far-reaching of the late Middle Ages. From the 1370s until his death in 1405, he launched a series of conquests that stretched from India to Anatolia, from the steppes of Russia to the deserts of Persia. Like the Mongols before him, he relied on the speed and mobility of cavalry, the discipline of hardened warriors, and the terror of psychological warfare.
But his methods were often even more ruthless than those of Genghis Khan. In Persia, Timur waged war against rival dynasties, sacking cities and massacring inhabitants. In Isfahan, after a rebellion broke out, he ordered the execution of tens of thousands, their skulls piled into pyramids as a warning. In Delhi, during his invasion of India in 1398, his forces looted the city for days, leaving it devastated. Chroniclers speak of streets filled with corpses, of treasures carried away, of a city that took generations to recover. And yet, Timur was not merely a destroyer. He saw himself as a patron of culture and a builder of empires. In Samarkand, he gathered artisans and scholars from across the lands he conquered. Captured craftsmen were transported to his capital to build mosques, palaces, and gardens of extraordinary beauty. The Bibi Khanyim Mosque, the Registan, and other monuments of Samarkand still stand today as testaments to his vision. He patronized scholars of astronomy and mathematics, laying the groundwork for a flourishing of Central Asian science. Timur's ambition was boundless. He sought not only to rule Central Asia, but to dominate the Islamic world and to project his power into Europe. In 1402, at the Battle of Ankara, he faced the rising Ottoman Empire under Sultan Bayezid I. The Ottomans, already expanding into the Balkans and threatening Byzantium, seemed destined to become the next great power. Yet, Timur's armies crushed them. Bayezid himself was captured, reportedly held in an iron cage until his death. The Ottoman advance into Europe was halted and their empire thrown into crisis, a crisis from which they would recover, but only after years of struggle. For Europe, Timur's victory over the Ottomans was a strange blessing.
While his conquests elsewhere brought devastation, in this case they delayed the Ottoman expansion into Christian lands. In distant courts from Venice to Paris, rulers heard of Timur's campaigns with a mix of fear and relief, wondering if this new conqueror might prove an unlikely ally against their eastern rivals. But Timur's ultimate ambition lay farther east. He dreamed of reuniting the Mongol world, of conquering China and reviving the glory of Genghis Khan. In 1405, he set out on his final campaign, leading a massive army toward the Min dynasty that had replaced the Yuan. The march was long, across the cold steppes of Central Asia, and Timur, now nearly 70 years old, was weary. In the city of Otrar, before he could reach China, he fell ill and died. His armies, deprived of his leadership, turned back. The dream of a new Mongol Empire died with him. The empire Timur left behind was vast but fragile. Like the Mongols before him, he had conquered with astonishing speed, but had not built lasting institutions to sustain his realm. Within a generation, his empire fragmented. Yet his legacy endured. Samarkand remained a center of culture, and his descendants, the Temurids, continued to rule parts of Central Asia and Persia. Among them was a figure whose influence would stretch far beyond the steppe, Babur, who would go on to found the Mughal Empire in India, a dynasty that traced its lineage back to both Timur and Genghis Khan. Thus, through Timur, the Mongol legacy found new life. His conquests reshaped the map of Eurasia, destabilizing powers, shifting trade routes, and creating a cultural flowering in Central Asia. His brutality earned him fear and hatred, but his patronage of art and science left behind wonders that continue to inspire awe.
What does Timur's story tell us about the broader Mongol tradition? It shows us that the idea of the Mongol Empire was greater than its political reality. Even after the Khanates had splintered, even after the Yuan dynasty had fallen, the image of Genghis Khan and the memory of Mongol conquest remained powerful symbols. Timur tapped into that memory to justify his own ambitions, proving that the legacy of the steppe could still command respect and fear across continents. By the early 15th century, the age of Mongol world conquest was truly ending. The Khanates weakened, Timur's empire fragmented, and new powers rose to fill the vacuum. The Ottomans recovered from their defeat and began their steady march toward empire once more. The Ming dynasty in China reasserted itself, rebuilding walls and fleets to secure its dominance. In Europe, the Renaissance was beginning to dawn, a cultural rebirth made possible in part by the very exchanges the Mongols had set in motion. And yet, for all these changes, the imprint of the Mongol era was indelible. From Moscow to Samarkand, from Delhi to Beijing, the world bore the scars of conquest and the fruits of connection. The Mongol Empire, though gone, had reshaped the very fabric of Eurasia. As our story continues, we will follow these echoes into the 15th and 16th centuries, tracing how the Mongol legacy endured not only through the Timurids and the Mughals, but also through the transformation of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange across the Old World. The empire of the horsemen was gone, but its shadow stretched long into the centuries that followed. When Timur, or Tamerlane, died in 1405, his empire stretched across vast swaths of Central Asia, Persia, and parts of the Middle East.
Yet, like the Mongol empires before him, it was bound together less by institutions than by the sheer force of his personality and his ruthless command. With his passing, fragmentation came swiftly. His descendants, known as the Timurids, inherited not a unified empire, but a patchwork of territories, fragile and contested. Still, though Timur's empire fractured, his lineage remained potent. For generations, the Timurids ruled cities such as Samarkand, Herat, and Bukhara, fostering a brilliant cultural flowering. Persian literature thrived under their patronage, architecture reached new heights, and advances in astronomy and mathematics were made in the observatories of Central Asia. The scholar Ulugh Beg, Timur's grandson, built one of the most advanced observatories of the 15th century in Samarkand, where he and his team charted the stars with remarkable accuracy. But politically, the Timurids faced challenges. Pressures from nomadic Uzbeks in the steppe, competition from Persian dynasties, and internal rivalries weakened their power. By the late 15th century, the once mighty Timurid domains were shrinking and new powers were rising. In Persia, the Safavids emerged, bringing with them a new wave of Islamic statecraft centered on Shi'ism. In Central Asia, Uzbek tribes carved out new realms. And yet, Timur's legacy did not end there.
From his line came a figure who would leave an indelible mark on world history, Zahir-ud-Din Muhammad, better known as Babur. Born in 1483 in the city of Andijan in the Fergana Valley of modern-day Uzbekistan, Babur was a prince of the Timurid family. On his father's side, he traced his lineage to Timur. On his mother's, he claimed descent from Genghis Khan himself. This dual heritage gave Babur a unique sense of legitimacy, connecting him to two of the greatest conquerors in history. Babur's early life was filled with hardship and ambition. As a boy, he inherited a small kingdom in the Fergana Valley, but he faced constant threats from rival warlords, nomadic tribes, and the powerful Uzbeks under Muhammad Shaibani. Babur dreamed of restoring the glory of the Timurids, of ruling Samarkand, the splendid capital his ancestors had built. He fought repeatedly to seize it, and for a time he succeeded. But each time he captured the city, he was driven out again. The shifting fortunes of Central Asia offered him no lasting power. Defeated in his struggle for Samarkand, Babur turned his eyes southward. Across the Hindu Kush mountains lay India, a land of immense wealth, fertile plains, and great cities. India in the early 16th century was fragmented, its once mighty Delhi Sultanate weakened by internal divisions and invasions. To Babur, it offered both opportunity and destiny. In 1526, Babur marched into northern India with an army far smaller than that of his opponents. At the Battle of Panipat, he faced Ibrahim Lodi, the last Sultan of Delhi, who commanded perhaps 100,000 men and 100 war elephants. Babur's own force numbered barely 15,000. Yet Babur brought with him tactics that echoed the steppe tradition of his ancestors, combined with innovations he had learned in Central Asia. His army used mobility, cavalry maneuvers, and most importantly, gunpowder weapons, field artillery, and matchlock muskets that were still unfamiliar to many Indian armies. The battle was decisive. Babur's cannons terrified the elephants, throwing them into chaos, while his cavalry enveloped the larger enemy force. Ibrahim Lodi was slain, and Delhi fell. With this victory, Babur established the foundation of what would become the Mughal Empire, named from the Persian word for Mongol. Though his dynasty would rule India for centuries, Babur himself still thought of himself as a Timurid prince, an heir of both Timur and Genghis Khan, carving out his destiny in a new land. Babur's rule in India was short. He died in 1530, only 4 years after Panipat. But his descendants carried on his work. The Mughal Empire became one of the most enduring and influential states of the early modern period. Under rulers like Akbar the Great, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb, it expanded across nearly the entire subcontinent, blending Persian, Central Asian, and Indian traditions into a unique synthesis. The Mongol legacy, transmitted through Timur and Babur, thus found new expression in the Mughal world. The Mughals ruled not as nomadic Khans, but as emperors of one of the richest and most diverse lands on earth. They built monumental architecture, including the Taj Mahal, commissioned by Shah Jahan in memory of his wife Mumtaz Mahal. They patronized art, literature, and music, creating a cultural fusion that still resonates in South Asia today. What is remarkable is how the Mughal Empire, though distant in time and place from the Mongols of Genghis Khan, still carried echoes of the steppe. The emphasis on cavalry, the use of mobility in battle, the aura of universal kingship, all were elements inherited from their nomadic ancestors. At the same time, the Mughals transformed these traditions to fit the realities of ruling a vast, settled, and agricultural land. The rise of the Mughals shows us another dimension of the Mongol legacy: adaptability. Just as Genghis Khan had once integrated Chinese engineers, Persian administrators, and diverse peoples into his empire, so too did the Mughals embrace the pluralism of India. Akbar, perhaps the greatest of the Mughal emperors, extended religious tolerance, engaging in dialogue with Hindus, Muslims, Christians, and Jains. His court became a place of debate, philosophy, and innovation. And yet, as with all empires, the Mughal dynasty faced its cycles of strength and decline. Aurangzeb, the last great Mughal ruler of the 17th century, expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, but also sowed seeds of division through stricter policies. By the 18th century, the empire weakened, challenged by regional powers, and eventually overtaken by European colonial expansion. Still, the Mughal experience reminds us of how the Mongol legacy did not vanish with the fall of the Yuan or the disintegration of the Golden Horde. It traveled, transformed, and endured in unexpected ways. Through Babur and his descendants, the spirit of the steppe was transplanted into the fertile soil of India, where it flourished in forms Genghis Khan could scarcely have imagined. By the 16th century, then, the direct political power of the Mongols had faded in many regions, but their influence remained. In Russia, the memory of Mongol domination shaped the rise of Moscow and the creation of a centralized Russian state. In Central Asia, the Timurids and later the Uzbeks carried forward elements of steppe tradition. In Persia, the Safavids inherited structures first introduced under Mongol and Timurid rule. And in India, the Mughals became heirs to a world empire in their own right. It is here that we begin to see the true answer to our original question. How did the Mongol Empire not only conquer, but also rule such a vast territory? The answer lies not only in military genius and pragmatic governance, but also in legacy. The Mongols built systems of communication, of administration, of cultural exchange that outlived their empire. They left behind not just ruins, but bridges between worlds. Their story is not a single arc of rise and fall, but a series of echoes that continued to shape Eurasia for centuries. As we move into the next part of our journey, we will follow these echoes into the age of global exploration and the dawn of European colonial empires. For the Mongols, though long gone as rulers, had helped create the interconnected world that made such exploration possible. The Silk Road they secured, the knowledge they transmitted, the boundaries they shattered, all these laid the groundwork for the modern age. When the Mongol Empire fragmented in the 14th century, it might have seemed that their story was ending, that their conquests would be remembered only for the terror they spread and the ruins they left behind. Yet the truth is more complex. The Mongols were not only destroyers, but also transmitters, connectors, and builders in ways that reverberated long after their political power collapsed. In Russia, in the Middle East, and even in Europe, their legacy continued to shape events for centuries. Let us begin in the forests and plains of Eastern Europe, where the Golden Horde had once held sway. For 200 years, from the mid-13th to the late 15th century, the Russian principalities lived under Mongol domination. The Khans of the Golden Horde demanded tribute, and Russian princes traveled to their court to offer submission. This period, often called the Mongol Yoke, was remembered bitterly in later Russian history. Cities were burned, populations displaced, and independence denied. Yet beneath this story of subjugation lay another, subtler tale. The Mongols, though foreign rulers, indirectly helped shape the rise of Moscow. The princes of Moscow were favored by the Horde as reliable tax collectors. They gathered tribute not only for the Khans, but also for themselves, gradually amassing wealth and influence. By the time the Golden Horde weakened in the 15th century, Moscow had become the leading Russian principality, ready to assert its independence. In 1380, at the Battle of Kulikovo, Prince Dmitry Donskoy led Russian forces against the Mongols and won a symbolic victory, though Mongol dominance was not fully broken until later. The final confrontation came in 1480, during the reign of Ivan III, also known as Ivan the Great. At the Ugra River, Russian and Mongol armies faced one another but did not fight. The Mongols withdrew and Russia was free. This bloodless standoff marked the end of Mongol rule in Russia. Yet, the centuries of Mongol overlordship left a mark. The centralized authority that Moscow developed, the reliance on tribute and taxation, the use of steppe cavalry tactics, all bore the imprint of the Golden Horde. Some historians argue that the autocratic traditions of Russian governance were shaped in part by the Mongol period, when absolute submission to the Khan became the norm. Thus, while the Mongols departed, their shadow lingered in the political culture of Russia. Turning south and west, we find the Ilkhanate in Persia, which collapsed in the 14th century but left behind profound influences. The Mongols had brought destruction to Persia, sacking cities and burning fields, yet they also introduced new ideas, new systems of administration, and new cultural exchanges. Under rulers like Genghis Khan, who converted to Islam, Persian culture flourished anew. Art, literature, and architecture blended Mongol and Persian traditions, producing forms that would later inspire the Safavid dynasty. The Mongol presence also reshaped the Middle East in geopolitical terms. The sack of Baghdad in 1258 ended the Abbasid Caliphate as a political force, though the Abbasid families survived in Cairo under the protection of the Mamluks. The psychological impact of Baghdad's fall was immense, a trauma remembered in Islamic history as one of the darkest moments. Yet the Mongol failure to conquer Egypt, defeated by the Mamluks at Ain Jalut in 1260, also became a defining moment. It marked the point where Mongol expansion was halted in the West, and it cemented the Mamluks as defenders of the Islamic world. The relationship between the Mongols and the Islamic world did not remain purely hostile. Over time, as Khans converted to Islam, Mongol rulers in Persia and Central Asia became patrons of Islamic scholarship and art. They built mosques, supported scholars, and integrated themselves into the Islamic tradition. The Ilkhanate dynasty, though Mongol in origin, became an Islamic dynasty in practice. This blending of identities is one of the most striking aspects of Mongol rule. They did not remain outsiders forever, but gradually absorbed the cultures they had conquered. Now let us turn our gaze westward, to Europe itself. The Mongols never conquered the heart of Europe, though their armies reached as far as Poland and Hungary. Yet the fear they inspired was profound. Chroniclers described them as a scourge, a punishment from God, an unstoppable force from the east. Kings and popes sent envoys seeking to understand these strange horsemen who seemed to appear and vanish like ghosts. Some envoys, such as Giovanni da Pian del Carpine and William of Rubruck, traveled deep into Mongol lands, reaching Karakorum itself. They returned with accounts of Mongol life, governance, and military power. For Europe, the Mongols became both a terror and a fascination. Rumors spread that they might be connected to the legendary Christian king Prester John, or that they might be converted into allies against the Muslims. The truth, of course, was more complicated. Yet the Mongols did influence Europe in indirect but profound ways. By securing the Silk Road and creating the Pax Mongolica, they opened new channels of trade. European merchants, such as the famous Marco Polo, traveled farther than ever before, bringing back tales of wealth and wonder from China. These stories sparked European imagination, planting seeds of curiosity that would later blossom into the age of exploration. Consider the world of the late 13th and 14th centuries. European markets began to see goods such as silk, porcelain, and spices arriving more regularly, carried by caravans that crossed Mongol lands. Technologies such as gunpowder and printing, invented in China, made their way westward. Even the compass, crucial for navigation, traveled along these routes. Europe, emerging from the Middle Ages, now had a window into the wider world, and much of that window had been opened by the Mongols. But there was a darker side as well. Along with goods and ideas, disease traveled the Silk Road. In the 1340s, the bubonic plague spread from Central Asia into Europe, devastating populations. The Black Death killed perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population, reshaping its economy, society, and culture. The Mongols, unintentionally, had facilitated this catastrophe by connecting the world more tightly than ever before. Even in death and decline then, the Mongols remained world shapers. Their legacy in Russia was the rise of Moscow and the centralization of power. In Persia, it was the blending of Mongol and Islamic traditions, leading to new cultural forms. In Europe, it was both terror and inspiration, a shock that forced kings and merchants alike to think beyond their borders. By the 15th century, the Mongol Khanates had either collapsed or transformed beyond recognition. The Yuan dynasty was gone, replaced by the Ming. The Ilkhanate had fragmented, giving way to the Safavids. The Golden Horde weakened until it disappeared, replaced by Muscovite Russia and later the Crimean Khanate. And yet, the echoes remained. What then do we see when we look at the Mongols from this vantage point? We see not only conquerors, but also connectors. Their empire was an empire of movement, of armies, yes, but also of merchants, artisans, scholars, and ideas. They did not leave behind a single enduring state, but they left behind a changed world. The horses are gone, the yurts are empty, but the hoofbeats of the Mongols still echo in the structures of power, in the flow of trade, in the very fabric of global history. From Moscow to Delhi, from Samarkand to Venice, their influence was woven into the story of civilization. And as we move forward into the 15th and 16th centuries, we will see how the Mongol legacy shaped the dawning of the modern world. For the age of exploration, the rise of gunpowder empires, and the birth of global trade all carry in some way the imprint of the Mongol Empire. When we think of the Mongols, we often imagine thundering horsemen on the open steppe, bows in hand, banners streaming, cities trembling at their approach. Rarely do we think of them as precursors to the European explorers who sailed across oceans, seeking new lands and new trade routes. Yet, in a very real sense, the Mongol Empire helped to prepare the ground for the age of exploration. Their conquests, their governance, and their unintended consequences reshaped Eurasia in ways that made the modern world possible. To understand this, we must first remember what the world looked like before the Mongols. In the early Middle Ages, Eurasia was fragmented. China was distant and mysterious to Europeans, known only through whispers of silk and porcelain. The Islamic world dominated the trade routes of the Middle East, while the Byzantine Empire served as a bridge between East and West. Europe, still recovering from centuries of turmoil, was provincial and relatively isolated. Then came the Mongols. By uniting the steppe and conquering lands from China to the Mediterranean, they created something extraordinary, a single political framework across much of Eurasia. For the first time in centuries, caravans could travel vast distances with relative safety, protected by the authority of Mongol Khans. Merchants, missionaries, and travelers moved freely across regions that had once been perilous. This was the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. The Silk Road, long a patchwork of routes vulnerable to bandits and wars, became a true artery of global exchange under Mongol rule. Chinese silk, paper, and gunpowder moved westward. Persian textiles and medicines traveled east. European glassware and silver entered markets thousands of miles away. Along with goods came knowledge, maps, astronomical observations, medical texts, and technologies. For a brief century, the Mongols bound the old world together. Among those who benefited most were the Italians. Cities like Venice and Genoa sent merchants deep into Asia, establishing trading posts and forging connections with Mongol courts. The most famous of these merchants, of course, was Marco Polo. Traveling with his father and uncle, Polo reached the court of Kublai Khan in the late 13th century. His accounts of the wealth and splendor of the East captivated Europe when he returned. Many readers dismissed his tales as fantasy, but for others, they were a revelation. Marco Polo described cities larger than any in Europe, with markets overflowing with goods, paper money in circulation, and roads bustling with trade. He wrote of the riches of Cathay, of Japan's fabled gold, of spices and jewels beyond imagining. Whether every detail was accurate or not, his book opened European eyes to the possibilities of the wider world. When Christopher Columbus set sail in 1492, he carried a copy of Marco Polo's travels, hoping to reach the lands described within. But it was not only curiosity that the Mongols fostered. They also transmitted technologies that would make exploration possible. Consider gunpowder. First developed in China, it traveled westward through Mongol lands, eventually transforming European warfare. Firearms and cannon gave explorers and conquistadors the edge when they encountered new peoples across the oceans. Or take the compass, another Chinese innovation, spread along trade routes. By the 14th century, Europeans were using it for navigation at sea. Combined with improvements in ship design, such as the caravel, the compass allowed sailors to venture farther from shore, confident they could find their way. Even printing, another Chinese invention, reached Europe through Mongol channels, eventually fueling the spread of knowledge during the Renaissance. Yet there was also a darker inheritance. The very networks that carried goods and knowledge also carried disease. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the mid-14th century, is believed to have traveled along the Silk Road, facilitated by Mongol rule. Some accounts even describe Mongols catapulting plague-infected corpses into besieged cities, such as at Kaffa in 1347. From there, the plague spread on ships to the Mediterranean, unleashing a pandemic that killed millions. The plague had profound consequences for Europe. It weakened feudal structures, disrupted economies, and created labor shortages that, in some regions, empowered peasants and workers. In its aftermath, Europe entered a period of transformation, with shifts in religion, science, and politics. In a strange way, the catastrophe helped prepare Europe for the dynamic changes of the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. The Mongols, by connecting Eurasia, had both enriched and imperiled the world. By the 15th century, the Mongol Empire itself had disintegrated. The Yuan dynasty had fallen, replaced by the Ming in China. The Golden Horde was fragmenting, challenged by the rising power of Moscow. The Ilkhanate had dissolved, leaving Persia open to new dynasties such as the Safavids. The Chagatai Khanate splintered into rival states. Yet even in decline, the pathways the Mongols had created remained. Merchants and travelers continued to use the routes established under the Pax Mongolica, even as new powers arose to guard them. But a great challenge loomed for Europe, the Ottoman Empire. Rising from the ashes of Mongol disruption, the Ottomans conquered Constantinople in 1453, cutting off many of the traditional overland trade routes to Asia. Spices, silk, and precious goods became harder and more expensive to obtain. European merchants and monarchs, frustrated by the growing power of Ottoman intermediaries, began to dream of alternatives. Could there be a sea route to India and China, bypassing the Islamic empires that stood between? This question, born out of necessity, was also fueled by the legacy of Mongol-connected exploration. Europeans knew more about Asia than they had before. They had read Marco Polo, heard tales from envoys and merchants, and seen with their own eyes the goods that caravans had brought. The desire for direct access to Asia was stronger than ever, and it drove the great voyages of the 15th and 16th centuries. Portuguese navigators, under Prince Henry the Navigator, began sailing along the coast of Africa, seeking a route to India. Vasco da Gama eventually reached Calicut in 1498, opening the first direct sea link between Europe and Asia. Spanish explorers, under Ferdinand and Isabella, backed Columbus in his westward journey, which he believed would take him to Asia. Though he found the Americas instead, his voyage was deeply inspired by the dream of reaching Cathay and the lands described by Polo. Thus, the Mongol Empire, though long gone, played a role in sparking the age of exploration. By connecting East and West, they had whetted Europe's appetite for Asian goods. By transmitting technologies, they had given Europeans the tools for oceanic voyages. By fostering curiosity through travelers like Marco Polo, they had filled European minds with visions of distant wealth. And by collapsing, leaving the Ottomans to dominate overland trade, they had forced Europeans to seek new routes by sea. The irony is striking. The horsemen of the steppe, who once seemed to threaten Europe with annihilation, ended up helping set the stage for Europe's global expansion. The Mongol bow and the European sail were not directly connected, yet without the one, the other might never have come into being. As the 16th century dawned, European ships began to circle the globe, carrying with them goods, guns, and the seeds of empire. This was a new kind of conquest, not on horseback, but on the waves. And yet, at its roots lay the Mongol Empire, whose rise and fall had reshaped the world. In the next stage of our journey, we will explore how the Mongol legacy lived on, not only in exploration, but also in the very structures of empire. From Russia to India, from China to Persia, the echoes of Genghis Khan's vision continued to shape rulers who sought to command vast and diverse populations. For even as the Mongols disappeared, the idea of empire they embodied remained alive. The Mongol Empire, in its own lifetime, was a paradox. It was both the most destructive and the most connective force of the medieval world. Cities burned, populations perished, but new trade routes flourished, new political systems emerged, and the very idea of empire was reshaped. When the Mongol Khanates fragmented and faded, their influence did not vanish. Instead, it seeped into the structures of the great states that followed. Russia, the Ottoman Empire, the Safavids of Persia, the Mughals of India, and the Ming dynasty of China. To trace their stories is to see how the Mongol legacy endured in political forms long after the riders themselves had disappeared from the steppe. Let us begin with Russia. For over 2 centuries, the Russian principalities had lived under Mongol domination, the so-called Mongol yoke. When the Golden Horde weakened and Moscow asserted its independence in the late 15th century, the Russians did not simply discard Mongol practices. They absorbed them. The centralized authority of the Muscovite princes bore striking similarities to the autocratic rule of the Khans. Ivan III, known as Ivan the Great, styled himself as the heir not only of Byzantine emperors through his marriage to Sophia Paleologina, but also, implicitly, as the successor to Mongol overlords. He inherited their system of tribute and their demand for absolute loyalty, transforming it into the foundation of Russian autocracy. Even the Russian military bore Mongol imprints. The emphasis on cavalry tactics, on mobility and steppe warfare persisted for centuries. Later, as firearms spread, these traditions blended with new technologies, but the memory of Mongol strategies remained. The Russians, once subjects of the Golden Horde, would eventually expand eastward, conquering Siberia and moving across the steppe in a reversal of fortune. In doing so, they echoed the very empire that had once dominated them. Turning southward, we arrive in Anatolia and the Middle East, where the Ottoman Empire rose in the 14th and 15th centuries.
At first glance, the Ottomans seem far removed from the Mongols. They were Turks, not Mongols, and their empire was maritime as well as land-based. Yet, the Mongol legacy shaped their rise in subtle ways. The Mongol invasions had shattered the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum in Anatolia, creating a power vacuum. Into this void stepped small Turkish principalities, one of which was led by Osman, the founder of the Ottoman dynasty. Without the Mongol disruption, the Ottomans might never have found the opportunity to rise. Moreover, like the Mongols, the Ottomans ruled over diverse peoples and faiths. Their system of governance, the millet system, which allowed religious communities a degree of autonomy, echoed the Mongol policy of tolerance. The Ottomans, like the Khans before them, understood that empire could not be sustained by force alone. It required pragmatism and adaptability. In Persia, the Safavids emerged in the early 16th century as heirs not to the Mongols directly, but to the political landscape they had left behind. The Ilkhanate had collapsed in the 14th century, and the Timurids had briefly filled the void.
From the ashes, the Safavids rose, establishing Shi'ism as the state religion of Persia. While this marked a decisive shift from Mongol religious tolerance to sectarian identity, the Safavids nonetheless inherited the Mongol tradition of centralized authority and military power. Their shahs, like the Khans before them, claimed universal rule over a diverse and multi-ethnic realm. The Safavid state was also deeply shaped by Persian administrators and culture, much as the Mongol Ilkhans had been. Architecture, poetry, and art flourished, but the shadow of the Mongols lingered in the memory of cities destroyed and rebuilt, in the very geography of power. Even the Safavid military, reliant on cavalry and steppe tactics before the widespread adoption of gunpowder, bore traces of Mongol methods. In India, the Mughal Empire, as we saw in our previous part, was a direct continuation of Mongol and Timurid traditions. Babur, its founder, traced his lineage to both Timur and Genghis Khan. But the Mughals did more than inherit, they transformed. They took the universal kingship of the Mongols and clothed it in the garments of Indian kingship. They adopted Persian as the language of administration, blended Central Asian cavalry traditions with Indian infantry, and ruled over a diverse, multi-religious land with a combination of tolerance and authority. Akbar the Great, perhaps the most famous Mughal ruler, exemplified this blend. Like the Mongols, he valued loyalty over lineage, elevating men of talent regardless of their origin. He encouraged dialogue between faiths, echoing the Mongol policy of religious openness. And like Kublai Khan in China, he embraced settled governance while never entirely forgetting the heritage of the steppe. The Mughal Empire, in its grandeur, was as much a cultural creation as a political one, a reminder of how the Mongol idea of empire could evolve in new soils.
Finally, we return to China, where the fall of the Yuan dynasty in 1368 brought an end to direct Mongol rule. The Ming dynasty, founded by Zhu Yuanzhang, or the Hongwu Emperor, defined itself in opposition to the Mongols. The Great Wall was rebuilt and expanded as a defense against future invasions. The Ming court sought to reassert Han Chinese traditions, restoring Confucian bureaucracy and centralizing authority. Yet, even here, the Mongol shadow remained. The very act of fortifying the northern frontier was a response to the memory of Mongol incursions. The Ming military, though adopting gunpowder weapons, continued to train cavalry for steppe warfare. The dynasty's diplomacy, cautious and controlling, was shaped by the trauma of foreign conquest. When the Ming sent out great naval expeditions under Zheng He in the early 15th century, part of their aim was to assert China's place in a world reshaped by Mongol connections. The Ming also inherited the infrastructure the Mongols had left behind. The postal relay system, the roads, the administrative divisions, all were absorbed and adapted.
Even paper currency, though it faltered under the Yuan, left a precedent that the Ming attempted to manage. The Mongol dynasty may have been cast as illegitimate, but its influence could not simply be erased. What unites all these cases, Russia, the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, and the Ming, is the way in which the Mongol model of empire lingered. The Khans had demonstrated that it was possible to rule vast, diverse lands with a mixture of force, pragmatism, and flexibility. They had shown that loyalty could be won through reward, that administration could incorporate foreign talent, that trade could be secured across thousands of miles. Later empires adapted these lessons to their own contexts, whether consciously or not. At the same time, they also reacted against Mongol rule. The Ming rejected Mongol cultural dominance, defining themselves as restorers of Chinese identity. The Safavids embraced Shi'ism, in part to distinguish themselves from their Sunni, Turkic, and Mongol predecessors. The Russians cast themselves as liberators from the Mongol yoke, even as they absorbed Mongol methods of governance. Each successor state negotiated with the Mongol legacy, sometimes embracing, sometimes resisting, but never escaping it. By the 16th century, then, the Mongols were no longer a political force, but their influence was everywhere. In the autocracy of Russia, in the tolerance of the Ottomans, in the cultural blending of the Mughals, in the sectarian identity of the Safavids, and in the defensive nationalism of the Ming, the echoes of Genghis Khan's empire lived on. This is the true measure of Mongol rule, not only in the lands they conquered, but in the patterns of empire that followed. They had reshaped Eurasia so thoroughly that even their absence was a presence. And yet, our journey is not over. In the next part, we will explore the cultural legacy of the Mongols, how their empire influenced art, science, religion, and identity across the Old World, leaving behind not just politics, but ideas and imaginations that still resonate today. When we think of the Mongols, it is easy to picture only conquest, the storm of hooves across the steppe, the smoke of burning cities, the fear that their name alone could inspire. And yet, to reduce them to destroyers alone is to miss the richness of their legacy. For in their vast empire, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Danube River, the Mongols also fostered exchanges of culture, science, religion, and imagination that transformed the Old World. Their conquests may have been violent, but their empire became a conduit through which the arts and sciences of civilizations met, mixed, and evolved. Let us begin with art and architecture. The Mongols themselves came from a tradition that was mobile and austere. Their yurts, or gurs, were practical and portable, their decorations often symbolic rather than monumental. Yet when they conquered the cities of China, Persia, and beyond, they became enthusiastic patrons of architecture. They built not only palaces and mosques, but also gardens, observatories, and caravanserai along trade routes. In Persia, the Ilkhanate rulers commissioned magnificent works that blended Mongol motifs with Islamic artistry. The mausoleum of Ilgai II in Sultaniyya, for example, stands as one of the largest brick domes in the world, an architectural marvel that shows how Mongol rulers embraced and expanded Persian styles. Intricate tile work, calligraphy, and geometric designs flourished under their patronage. By bringing artisans from different lands into their courts, the Mongols encouraged a cross-pollination of techniques that enriched Islamic art for centuries. In China, under the Yuan dynasty, architecture and painting also took new forms. The Mongols supported both Chinese and foreign artists, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere. Tibetan Buddhism flourished at court, influencing not only religious art but also visual culture. Temples and monasteries rose with Mongol patronage, while Chinese painters developed new styles under the Yuan, often emphasizing landscapes that carried subtle critiques of foreign rule. Art became both a means of patronage and a quiet form of resistance.
Beyond art, the Mongols were instrumental in the advancement of science and technology. By uniting vast regions under their rule, they created networks through which knowledge traveled. Chinese innovations such as gunpowder, paper, and printing spread westward. Persian advances in astronomy and medicine moved eastward.
Scholars and artisans were often relocated by force, taken from conquered lands to serve in new courts. Brutal though this was, it created hubs of knowledge that might never have existed otherwise. One of the most striking examples is the observatory built by Ulu Beg, grandson of Timur, in Samarkand. Though it came after the Mongol Empire proper, it grew from the Timurid tradition that the Mongols had set in motion. Ulu Beg's observatory produced star charts of remarkable accuracy, influencing astronomy in both the Islamic world and, eventually, in Europe. This flowering of science in Central Asia was unthinkable without the Mongol reshaping of the region. The Mongols also played a role in the transmission of medical knowledge. They employed physicians from different traditions, Chinese, Persian, Arab, bringing them together in their courts. Medical texts were translated and shared, and practices such as quarantine were employed in response to the spread of plague. Though they could not stop the Black Death, the Mongols helped spread the very knowledge that would eventually aid in combating disease. Religion, too, flourished under Mongol rule in surprising ways. The Mongols were traditionally shamanistic, worshipping the sky god Tengri and practicing rituals tied to the natural world. Yet from the very beginning, Genghis Khan had emphasized tolerance. As long as his subjects paid tribute and obeyed his laws, they were free to worship as they wished. This policy of tolerance allowed Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and other faiths to coexist across Mongol lands. In the Ilkhanate, rulers gradually converted to Islam, making it a central part of their identity. In China, the Yuan court supported Tibetan Buddhism, giving it prominence and influence. In the Golden Horde, Islam eventually became dominant, but Orthodox Christianity was tolerated in Russia, allowing the church to survive and even grow under Mongol rule. Religious diversity at the Mongol courts was extraordinary. Accounts tell of debates held between Christian priests, Muslim scholars, and Buddhist monks, each presenting their case before the Khans. While the Mongols themselves often remained aloof, preferring pragmatism to dogma, their courts became microcosms of the world's faiths. This environment of dialogue, however imperfect, shaped the religious landscape of Eurasia for centuries. But perhaps the most fascinating legacy of the Mongols lies in the realm of imagination, how they were perceived, remembered, and mythologized. To Europeans, the Mongols were at first a terror beyond comprehension. Chroniclers described them as monsters, as punishments sent by God, as the armies of Gog and Magog unleashed from biblical prophecy. Yet over time, fascination grew alongside fear. The possibility that the Mongols could be converted to Christianity, or that they might be allies against Muslim powers, colored papal diplomacy in the 13th century. Marco Polo's tales further transformed the Mongols in European imagination. His descriptions of Kublai Khan's court, of the riches of Cathay, of strange lands and peoples, captivated readers. For centuries afterward, the land of the Great Khan remained a symbol of wealth and wonder, inspiring explorers such as Columbus. The Mongols, once demonized, became part of Europe's dream of the East. In the Islamic world, memories were more ambivalent. The sack of Baghdad in 1258 was seared into collective consciousness as a catastrophe, a moment when libraries burned and scholars perished. Yet the later conversion of Mongol rulers to Islam softened their image. The Ilkhans and their successors were remembered as patrons as well as destroyers.
In Central Asia, the Mongols were woven into genealogies and legends, their legacy claimed by conquerors like Timur. Even in China, where the Yuan dynasty was remembered as foreign and illegitimate, Mongol influence lingered in subtle ways. Yuan-era innovations in drama, painting, and literature left a cultural mark. And the memory of Mongol conquest shaped Ming policies of defense and suspicion toward the steppe. The Great Wall, rebuilt and extended, stood as both a monument to Mongol power and a barrier against its return. The Mongols also reshaped the way empires thought about themselves. Their idea of universal rule, of authority that transcended ethnicity and religion, influenced successors across Eurasia. To be a ruler in the post-Mongol world was, in some sense, to contend with their example, whether to emulate it, adapt it, or reject it. In all these ways, art, science, religion, imagination, the Mongol legacy was richer and more complex than the stereotype of destruction suggests. They were conquerors, yes, but also patrons, connectors, and catalysts. They shattered old worlds but also built new ones. As we move forward in our story, we will turn to the final chapters, the decline of the Mongol legacy in the modern age, how their memory has been interpreted and reinterpreted, and what their story ultimately tells us about empire, power, and the human condition. By the time the early modern era dawned in the 16th century, the Mongol Empire was long gone. The Khanates had fragmented, the Yuan dynasty had been replaced by the Ming, the Golden Horde had withered, and the Ilkhanate had faded into memory. And yet, the Mongols continued to live on, not in power, but in memory, myth, and reputation. Across Eurasia, their story was retold, reshaped, and reinterpreted according to the needs and anxieties of later generations. To understand the Mongols is not only to examine what they did in life, but also how they were remembered in death. In Europe, the memory of the Mongols was ambivalent. For medieval chroniclers, they had been the horsemen of the apocalypse, a terror beyond comprehension. The invasions of Hungary and Poland in the 1240s had left deep scars, remembered in tales of entire armies swept aside. The Black Death, which followed the Mongols' trade routes, was sometimes blamed directly on them. Yet, with the passage of time, Europe began to reinterpret them. Marco Polo's travels painted a picture of Mongol-ruled China as a land of wealth, sophistication, and marvels. For Renaissance Europeans, this was no longer simply a story of fear, but of wonder, a glimpse into a wider world. During the Age of Exploration, the memory of the Mongols was reactivated in new ways. Explorers like Columbus read Polo's accounts, seeking the riches of the East that had once been accessible through Mongol-controlled trade routes. Cartographers placed the domains of the Great Khan on their maps, even long after the empire had ceased to exist. The Mongols became part of Europe's mental geography of the wider world, symbols of both danger and opportunity. In Russia, memory took a different shape. For centuries, the Russian principalities have lived under Mongol domination, paying tribute to the Khans of the Golden Horde. When Moscow finally threw off this yoke in the late 15th century, the Mongols became symbols of oppression and humiliation. Russian chroniclers portrayed them as cruel overlords, the embodiment of foreign tyranny. And yet, paradoxically, Russian autocracy itself bore the imprint of Mongol political traditions. The centralized authority of the czars, their demand for loyalty and tribute, and their use of steppe military strategies all echoed the practices of the Golden Horde. In this way, Mongol memory in Russia was both hated and embedded, a shadow that shaped governance even as it was condemned. In the Islamic world, memories were equally complex. The sack of Baghdad in 1258 remained a wound in collective memory, a moment of cultural catastrophe. Islamic historians often portrayed the Mongols as destroyers of civilization. Yet, as generations passed, the Mongol conversion to Islam softened their image. The Ilkhans of Persia, the rulers of the Golden Horde, and later the Timurids were remembered not only as conquerors, but as patrons of mosques, scholars, and art. By the time the Safavids rose in the 16th century, Mongol rule was seen as both a tragedy and a stage in the long history of Islamic lands. In China, the story was again different.
The Yuan dynasty, founded by Kublai Khan, was remembered as a foreign occupation, illegitimate and resented. Chinese historians of the Ming dynasty, eager to legitimize their own rule, emphasize the chaos, corruption, and oppression of Mongol governance. And yet, Yuan influence lingered in subtle ways. The structures of administration, the patterns of trade, even certain cultural forms carried Mongol imprints. For the Chinese, the Mongols became a cautionary tale of what happens when foreign barbarians seize the mandate of heaven. Their memory was not celebrated but used as a warning. As the modern era unfolded, Western scholars and travelers began to reinterpret the Mongols once more. In the 19th century, with the rise of Orientalist scholarship, the Mongols were studied as part of the grand sweep of world history. To some European historians, they were destroyers who delayed the progress of civilization. To others, they were figures of fascination, examples of raw power and energy. The Romantic imagination sometimes cast them as noble savages, untamed riders of the steppe. The truth, as always, was more complicated. In the 20th century, the Mongols took on new meanings. In the Soviet Union, historians grappled with the Mongol yoke as part of the Russian past. Some emphasized its destructive impact. Others argued that it had helped shape the centralized Russian state. In China, under both nationalist and communist regimes, the Yuan dynasty was interpreted through political lenses, sometimes condemned, sometimes reframed as part of the long arc of Chinese history. And in Mongolia itself, the memory of Genghis Khan endured as a source of pride. For centuries, his name had been both feared and revered across the world. Under socialist rule in the 20th century, his image was sometimes suppressed, as leaders sought to distance themselves from the feudal past. But after the fall of communism in the 1990s, Genghis Khan returned as a national hero. His face appeared on currency, his name was given to airports, universities, and companies. For Mongolians today, he is both a founding father and a symbol of national identity, proof that their small nation once shaped the course of world history. In the global imagination, the Mongols remain powerful figures. Hollywood films, novels, and popular histories often portray them as the ultimate warriors, ruthless and unstoppable. Yet in recent decades, scholarship has also emphasized their role as connectors, as facilitators of cultural exchange. The image of Genghis Khan as a bloodthirsty barbarian has been balanced by new perspectives that see him as a lawgiver, a unifier, a pragmatist who built systems that endured beyond his lifetime. What does this evolution of memory tell us? It shows that the Mongols were not only actors in history, but also symbols onto which later generations projected their fears, hopes, and identities. In Europe, they were at first the scourge of God, then the gatekeepers of the East. In Russia, they were oppressors and yet inadvertent teachers of autocracy. In the Islamic world, they were destroyers and then patrons. In China, they were illegitimate usurpers, but also part of the historical cycle of dynasties. In Mongolia, they are eternal heroes. To study the Mongols, then, is not only to ask what they did, but also to ask how we remember them. History is never fixed. It is retold and reimagined in each era. The Mongols, who once seemed to ride like storms across the earth, have continued to ride through human imagination for centuries. As we near the end of our journey, one final question remains. What lessons can we draw from the Mongol Empire today? What does their story tell us about power, conquest, globalization, and the human condition? In our next and final part, we will reflect on these questions, bringing together the threads of conquest and culture, destruction and creation, fear and fascination, to understand why the Mongols still matter in our world. We have followed the Mongols from the windswept steppes of Central Asia to the grand cities of China, from the markets of Persia to the plains of Hungary, from their rise under Genghis Khan to their echoes in the Mughal courts of India and the autocracy of Russia. We have traced their legacy through politics, culture, science, and imagination. Now, as we approach the end of our journey, it is time to step back and ask, what lessons can we draw from the Mongol Empire today? What does their story reveal about empire, power, and the human condition? The first lesson is the power of unity amid diversity. When Genghis Khan began his rise, the Mongols were divided into countless tribes, each feuding with the other. It was his genius not only to conquer, but to unify, to forge loyalty not based solely on kinship, but on merit and allegiance. This principle, simple yet revolutionary, allowed him to transform scattered clans into a disciplined force. For the modern world, this offers a reminder that unity is not always born of sameness, but can emerge from the recognition of shared purpose and mutual benefit. The second lesson is the importance of adaptability. The Mongols were born on horseback, raised in a nomadic culture with no cities of their own. Yet when they encountered the great civilizations of China, Persia, and the Islamic world, they did not reject them outright. Instead, they absorbed technologies, employed local administrators, and integrated foreign artisans. They became masters of adaptation. In China, they governed as emperors, in Persia as Islamic rulers, in Russia as overlords through tribute. Their empire was not one size fits all, but a patchwork of pragmatic solutions. In an age when globalization demands flexibility, the Mongols remind us of the power of adaptation. The third lesson is the double-edged nature of connectivity. By uniting Eurasia, the Mongols facilitated trade, communication, and cultural exchange on a scale unseen before. Goods and ideas traveled freely, creating what we might call a medieval form of globalization. Yet along with silk and spices came disease. The Black Death, carried along the very trade routes the Mongols secured, devastated populations from China to Europe. In our own time, when global connections bring both prosperity and vulnerability, the Mongol experience is a cautionary tale. Connectivity can enrich, but it can also expose. The fourth lesson is the paradox of empire itself. The Mongols conquered more land in a single lifetime than any empire before or since. And yet, their political unity did not endure. Within a century of Genghis Khan's death, the empire had fractured into khanates. Each ruled in its own way, but the dream of a universal empire faded. This reveals the inherent challenge of empires. They can conquer swiftly, but governing diverse peoples across vast distances requires more than force. Institutions, legitimacy, and shared identity are as crucial as military power. The Mongols achieved greatness through conquest, but could not sustain it indefinitely. The fifth lesson is about tolerance and intolerance. The Mongols, though ruthless in war, practiced a striking degree of religious tolerance in peace. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and others lived under their rule, often with official protection. This tolerance was pragmatic, aimed at reducing resistance and gaining allies, but it also allowed diverse cultures to coexist. At the same time, the Mongols could be brutally intolerant of political defiance. Cities that resisted were destroyed with mercy. This duality reminds us that tolerance in one sphere does not erase cruelty in another. Empires, like people, can be both open and ruthless. The sixth lesson is the role of memory. The Mongols themselves vanished as rulers, their empire dissolved. Yet their memory lived on, in Russian autocracy, in Mughal splendor, in European imagination, in Mongolian nationalism. Their story has been retold in countless ways, as terror, as inspiration, as heritage.
This reminds us that history is not only what happened, but also what we remember and how we interpret it. The Mongols, who once commanded through fear, continue to command through memory. But perhaps the deepest lesson of the Mongol Empire is the complexity of human achievement. They were destroyers and builders, feared and admired, barbaric and sophisticated. They burned cities but also built them anew. They killed millions but also connected millions more. They shattered old worlds but laid foundations for the modern one. To reduce them to either heroes or villains is to miss the truth. They were both and more. In a way, the Mongol story is a mirror. It reflects back to us our own questions about power, ambition, violence, and legacy. What does it mean to rule? What does it mean to connect? What price are we willing to pay for unity, for conquest, for glory? The Mongols asked and answered these questions in their own time, but the questions remain alive today. As we consider their legacy, we might imagine standing once more on the steppe, beneath that vast sky that seems to stretch into infinity. The grass rolls endlessly, the wind carries the echoes of hoofbeats, and in the distance one can almost hear the cry of warriors riding into battle. The Mongols are gone, but their empire was not only of land and stone, it was also of ideas, connections, and memory. That empire endures. For modern listeners, there is one final reflection. The Mongols show us the fragile line between destruction and creation, between isolation and connection.
Their empire teaches us that the world is always more interconnected than we think, that borders are more fragile, and that the rise and fall of powers can reshape lives far beyond their own frontiers. In our own global age, with its opportunities and dangers, this lesson is perhaps more urgent than ever. And so, as we near the end of our 2-hour journey, we find that the Mongols were not only conquerors of the past, but teachers for the present. They remind us of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and creativity, for both division and unity. They remind us that history is never one-sided, but always a tapestry of contradictions. In our final part, we will bring the threads together, concluding our story of the Mongol Empire with a reflection on why their saga continues to fascinate us, centuries after their empire crumbled to dust. The winds of the steppe have carried us a long way. We began with a boy named Temüjin, born into hardship, abandoned with his family, left to survive on the unforgiving grasslands of Mongolia. We followed him as he transformed from an orphan into Genghis Khan, uniting the tribes of the steppe into a single force and launching conquests that would reshape the world. We traced his descendants, Ogedei, Munkei, Kublai, who carried the empire to its zenith, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea. We watched as the empire fractured, as Timur revived its spirit, as the Mughals in India carried its legacy into a new age. We have seen its echoes in Russia, in Persia, in the Ottoman world, in Europe, and in China. And now, as we close this journey, we ask one final question. Why does the story of the Mongols still matter? It matters because the Mongols remind us of the scale of human ambition. Temüjin was not destined to rule. He was not born in a palace, not raised with wealth or learning. He began with nothing but hardship. Yet through will, vision, and ruthless determination, he carved out the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen. His life is a testament to the heights and dangers of ambition. It shows us that history is not always made by those who seem destined, but sometimes by those who refuse to accept the limits placed upon them. It matters because the Mongols remind us of the paradox of empire. They were conquerors who destroyed, but they were also rulers who connected. They burned cities to the ground, yet they built networks that stretched across continents. They killed millions, yet they also brought together cultures that had never met before. Theirs was an empire of contradictions, and in that it was profoundly human. For all empires, past and present, contain this tension between creation and destruction, order and chaos. It matters because the Mongols remind us of the power of connection. By uniting Eurasia, they made possible exchanges that shaped the modern world. Gunpowder, printing, the compass, these traveled along the routes they secured. Ideas and goods flowed more freely than ever before. Even the devastation of the Black Death, carried along those same routes, was part of this story of connection. In our own globalized age, when pandemics and technologies alike move across borders with astonishing speed, the Mongols feel strangely contemporary. It matters because the Mongols remind us of the fragility of power. Their empire rose faster than any in history, but it fractured within a century. No amount of conquest could erase the challenges of ruling vast and diverse lands.
Succession disputes, local resistance, cultural differences, all these eroded what conquest had achieved. The Mongols show us that power built on fear alone cannot endure forever. To last, empire requires more than armies. It requires legitimacy, institutions, and vision. It matters because the Mongols remind us of the endurance of memory. They vanished as rulers, but their name never disappeared. In Russia, they became the dark shadow of the Mongol yoke. In China, they became the foreign dynasty to be remembered and resisted. In Europe, they became the figures of both terror and fascination, the backdrop to Marco Polo's dreams. In Mongolia, they remain heroes, their founder honored as a national symbol. Memory, like empire, is never simple. The Mongols live on not only in history books, but in identities, in politics, in the stories nations tell about themselves. And it matters, finally, because the Mongols remind us of ourselves. We too live in a world shaped by ambition and fear, by unity and division, by destruction and creation. We too struggle with the double edge of connection, with the promise and peril of globalization. We too wrestle with the question of how power should be used and what legacy it leaves behind. In the Mongol Empire, we see not only the past, but also a mirror of the present. So let us return one last time to the steppe. Imagine the endless grasslands stretching to the horizon, the sky vast and unbroken. Imagine the sound of hoofbeats rising, the thunder of horses carrying warriors across the earth. Imagine the tents of a nomadic camp, the smoke of fires drifting into the air, the songs of a people bound to the land and the sky. From this world came a force that shook the foundations of civilizations, that redrew the map of the world, that left behind a legacy still with us today. The Mongols teach us that history is never simple. They were both destroyers and creators, feared and admired, remembered with horror and pride. They remind us that human beings are capable of both great cruelty and great achievement, sometimes in the same breath. They remind us that empires rise and fall, but their echoes endure. And so, as we close our story, let us carry with us the lessons of the Mongol Empire, the power of unity, the necessity of adaptation, the double-edged nature of connection, the fragility of conquest, the endurance of memory, and the complexity of humanity. This has been our journey through the rise and rule of the Mongols, from Temüjin's childhood on the steppe to the farthest reaches of their legacy. If you have enjoyed this long exploration, I invite you once more to subscribe, like, and share Night Owl Podcast History. Your support keeps these stories alive and ensures that the past continues to speak to the present. And now, as the night deepens and the echoes of hoofbeats fade into silence, we close the tale of the Mongol Empire. Thank you for traveling with me. Until our next journey together, may the winds of history carry you gently into dreams.